Hi class, today we're going to be looking at three variance analysis and two variance analysis. All right, we're going to be using the same exercise that we used for the other video, which is exercise 9:15. This is just a continuation of this exercise. And we're going to be looking at overhead variances using the two and three variance analysis. We're going to first look at the two variance analysis. And when you are using the two variance analysis, it's important to understand these items first before you try to create the two variance analysis. For companies that wish to avoid tracking actual variable and fixed cost, the two variance method can be used. Now, your company would choose to use either the four variance method, the two variance method, or the three variance method. But because companies can choose any of these methods, that's why we're going through all of them in this chapter. Two and three variance analysis do not require knowledge of actual variable and actual fixed cost. These methods will provide less detail and less information for management to evaluate. The first thing you need to know, especially when you're doing two variance analysis, is the budget variance is the sum of the fixed overhead spending variance, the variable overhead spending variance, and the variable overhead efficiency variance of the four variance method. So really what we could have done to find the budget variance is we could have gone back to the previous problem, 9:15, which was using the four variance analysis, and we could have added together the items that we got for the fixed overhead spending variance, the variable overhead spending variance, and the variable overhead efficiency variance. That'll give you the same thing as the budget variance using a two variance analysis. The applied overhead is going to be subtracted from the budgeted total overhead this time, to get the volume variance. So it's basically just like we did in the previous exercise. The applied overhead is going to be subtracted from the budgeted total overhead to get the volume variance. And this is where I've calculated the volume variance. And then lastly, the total variance is the sum of both the budget variance and the volume variance. All right, what they asked you for in Cengage was to calculate the budget variance using two variance analysis. The actual overhead was given, so you just plug that in. You're going to subtract from the actual overhead the total budgeted overhead based on the actual units produced. And what I've done is I've shown you how to do that right here. So to get the budgeted overhead based on actual units produced, you got to make these calculations. You're going to find the standard variable overhead rate, which is the budgeted variable overhead cost. And to find that, they gave you the total cost minus the fixed cost. This is your variable budgeted cost. And you're going to divide it by the budget hours, which were given at 480,000. That'll give you a standard variable overhead rate of 48 cents. We're going to multiply that by the standard hours. The standard hours is the time it takes to produce one unit. And you'll remember from the last exercise, we found that it took 4 hours to produce one unit. We're going to multiply that by the actual units produced, which was the given units. What that will give you is the standard hours. We're going to multiply the 48-cent standard variable overhead rate times the standard hours to get the variable overhead that is based on the actual units produced. Then we're going to add back our fixed overhead to our variable overhead to get the total budget overhead. And this total budget overhead is substituted into this formula right here. Then you're going to compare the actual overhead to the budgeted overhead. Because the actual is more than the budget, it was an unfavorable variance of $802. Or you could go back to the previous exercise and add together the fixed overhead spending variance using the 4 variance analysis, the variable overhead spending variance, and the variable overhead efficiency variance. When you combine all those together to give you the same thing of $802. So it'd probably be a good idea for you to look back at exercise 915 to see how they came up with this. So that's how you calculate the budget variance in the 2 variance analysis. The other analysis that you're going to create in the 2 variance analysis is the volume variance. And it is the same volume variance that we come up with on exercise 915 that we did previously. The formula for the volume variance is as follows. We're going to take the budgeted total overhead, which we just found in cell address B29, just brought that down, and you're going to compare that to the applied amount of overhead. And the applied amount of overhead is determined using these calculations. So we're going to take the standard variable overhead rate, and this shows you how to get that. You might remember from the last problem, it was 48 cents, plus the standard fixed overhead rate, which is your fixed budget divided by your budgeted hours, which will give you $1.16. The 2 of these together are the total overhead rate. So we add the 2 of these to get this. And then we multiply it by the standard hours. The standard hours we had come up with before, but I'm going to repeat it again here. It was the amount of time it takes to produce 1 unit times the actual units produced. 477,600 was substituted back up here. So the standard hours times the total overhead rate will give you the applied overhead, and that's what goes there. Once you have the applied overhead, you're going to subtract it from your budgeted total overhead, and that will give you the volume variance. And that's all they wanted you to do with part 1. Part 2 has you computing overhead variances using 3 variance analysis. So you'll notice that I've highlighted the 3 variance analysis in blue. When we are computing the 3 variance analysis, we're going to first compute the spending variance. And it's calculated as the total actual overhead, which was given. They gave you the variable and the fixed. The 2 of those combined is $786,850 less your budgeted fixed overhead plus the standard variable overhead rate times the actual hours. So do this first and then add it back to the fixed overhead, and that will give you this amount right here. The difference between these is 610, and it's unfavorable because the actual was more than this standard here. The variable overhead efficiency variance is calculated as taking the budgeted fixed overhead. The fixed overhead was given at 556,800. We're going to add to that the standard variable overhead rate times the actual hours. Multiply this first and then add it back to this. It will give you this. Or you could also pull it down from what we just calculated, the same figure. Less your budgeted fixed overhead, which the 556,800 was given, and then you had to multiply 48 cents times the standard hours, and that will give you the variable standard plus the variable overhead plus the fixed overhead together is 786,048. The difference between these two is an unfavorable variance, because this that was based on the actual is more than what the budgeted amount was. The volume variance is calculated next, and we're going to take the budgeted fixed overhead, and we're going to take the standard variable overhead rate of 48 cents times the standard hours of 477,600. And that standard hours we had calculated before up here. If you're wondering where that came from, it's the same one we've been using for standard hours. Multiply these two first, add this back to it, and it'll give you this. Then you're going to subtract out your applied overhead. Your applied overhead is calculated here. It's the standard variable overhead rate, 48 cents. This is showing you how it's calculated, plus the standard fixed overhead rate, which is the fixed overhead budget divided by the budget hours, will give you $1.16 for the standard fixed overhead rate. The two of these combined are the total overhead rate, and then we multiply it by the standard hours to get the applied overhead. This applied overhead is substituted back into this formula, and we subtract it from this to get this. Since this top figure was more than this one, it's an unfavorable variance. And so that's all that I'm going to share with you today. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.